this stock may never come down, especially since every day this is the case. After half a year, he invests his life savings in it, turning a blind eye to the huge cluster risk this poses. Later, the man will pay for his foolish investment. He's fallen hook, line, and sinker for induction. Inductive thinking doesn't have to be a road to ruin, though. In fact, you can make a fortune with it by sending a few emails. Here's how. Put together 2 stock market forecasts, one predicting that prices will rise next month and one warning of a drop. Send the first mail to 50,000 people and the second mail to a different set of 50,000. Suppose that after 1 month, the indices have fallen. Now you can send another email, but this time only to the 50,000 people who received a correct prediction. These 50,000 you divide into 2 groups. The first half learns that prices will increase next month, and the second half discovers they will fall. Continue doing this. After 10 months, around 100 people will remain, all of whom you've advised impeccably. From their perspective, you're a genius. You've proven that you're truly in possession of prophetic powers. Some of these people will trust you with their money. Take it and start a new life in Brazil. However, it's not just naive strangers who get deceived in this way. We constantly trick ourselves, too. For example, people who are rarely ill consider themselves immortal. CEOs who announce increased profits in consecutive quarters deem themselves infallible. Their employees and shareholders do too. I once had a friend who was a base jumper. He jumped off cliffs, antennae in buildings, pulling the ripcord only at the last minute. One day, I brought up how risky his chosen sport is. He replied quite matter-of-factly, "I've over 1,000 jumps under my belt, and nothing has ever happened to me." 2 months later, he was dead. It happened when he jumped from a particularly dangerous cliff in South Africa. This single event was enough to eradicate a theory confirmed 1,000 times over. Inductive thinking can have devastating results, yet we cannot do without it. We trust that when we board a plane, aerodynamic laws will still be valid, and we imagine that we will not be randomly beaten up on the street. We expect that our hearts will still be beating tomorrow. These are confidences without which we couldn't live. But we must remember that certainties are always provisional. As Benjamin Franklin said, nothing is certain but death and taxes. Induction seduces us and leads us to conclusions such as, mankind has always survived, so we'll be able to tackle any future challenges too. Sounds good in theory, but what we fail to realize is that such a statement can only come from a species that has lasted until now. To assume that our existence to date is an indication of our future survival is a serious flaw in reasoning, probably the most serious of all. 32. Why evil is more striking than good. Loss aversion. On a scale of 1 to 10, how good do you feel today? Now consider what would bring you up to a perfect 10. That vacation in the Caribbean you always dreamed of? A step up the career ladder, maybe. Next question. What would make you drop down by the same number of points? Paralysis, Alzheimer's, cancer, depression, war, hunger, torture, financial ruin, damage to your reputation, losing your best friend, your children getting kidnapped, blindness, death. The long list of possibilities makes us realize just how many obstacles to happiness exist. In short, there are more bad things than good, and they're far more consequential. In our evolutionary past, this was even more the case. One stupid mistake, and you were dead. Everything could lead to your rapid departure from the game of life. Carelessness on the hunt, an inflamed tendon, exclusion from the group, and so on. People who were reckless or gung-ho died before they could pass their genes on to the next generation. Those who remained, the cautious, survived. We are their descendants. So no wonder we fear loss more than we value gain. Losing $100 costs you a greater amount of happiness than the delight you would feel if I gave you $100. In fact, it's been proven that emotionally, a loss weighs about twice that of a similar gain. Social scientists call this loss aversion. For this reason, if you want to convince someone about something, don't focus on the advantages. Instead, highlight how it helps them dodge the disadvantages. Here's an example from a campaign promoting breast self-examination, BSE. Two different leaflets were handed out to women. Pamphlet A urged, research shows that women who do BSE have an increased chance of finding a tumor in the early, more treatable state of the disease. Pamphlet B said, research shows that women who do not BSE have a decreased chance of finding a tumor in the early, more treatable state of the disease. The study revealed that pamphlet B, written in a loss frame, generated significantly more awareness and BSE behavior than pamphlet A, written in a gain frame. The fear of losing something motivates people more than the prospect of gaining something of equal value. Suppose your business is home insulation. The most effective way of encouraging customers to purchase your product is to tell them how much money they're losing without insulation, as opposed to how much money they would save with it, even though the amount is exactly the same. This type of aversion is also found on the stock market, where investors tend to simply ignore losses on paper. After all, an unrealized loss isn't as painful as a realized one. So they sit on the stock, even if the chance of recovery is small and the probability of further decline is large. I once met a man, a multimillionaire, who was terribly upset because he had lost a $100 bill. What a waste of emotion. I pointed out that the value of his portfolio fluctuated by at least $100 every second. Management gurus push employees in large companies to be bolder and more entrepreneurial. The reality is, employees tend to be risk averse. From their perspective, this aversion makes perfect sense. Why risk something that brings them, at best, a nice bonus, and at worst, a pink slip? The downside is larger than the upside. In almost all companies and situations, safeguarding your career trumps any potential reward. So if you've been scratching your head about the lack of risk-taking among your employees, you now know why. However, if employees do take big risks, it is often when they can hide behind group decisions. Learn more in Chapter 33 on social loafing. We can't fight it. Evil is more powerful and more plentiful than good. We are more sensitive to negative than to positive things. On the street, scary faces stand out more than smiling ones. We remember bad behavior longer than good, except, of course, when it comes to ourselves. 33. Why teams are lazy. Social loafing. Maximilian Ringelmann, a French engineer, studied the performance of horses in 1913. He concluded that the power of two animals pulling a coach did not equal twice the power of a single horse. Surprised by this result, he extended his research to humans. He had several men pull a rope and measured the force applied by each individual. On average, if two people were pulling together, each invested just 93% of his individual strength. When three pulled together, it was 85%, and with 8 people, just 49%. Science calls this the social loafing effect. It occurs when individual performance is not directly visible. It blends into the group effort. It occurs among rowers, but not in relay races, because here individual contributions are evident. Social loafing is rational behavior. Why invest all of your energy when half will do? Especially when this little shortcut goes unnoticed. Quite simply, social loafing is a form of cheating of which we are all guilty, even if it takes place unconsciously, just as it does with the horses. When people work together, individual performances decrease. This isn't surprising. What is noteworthy, however, is that our input doesn't grind to a complete halt. So what stops us from putting our feet up and letting others do the hard work? The consequences. Zero performance would be noticed, and it brings with it weighty punishments, such as exclusion from the group or vilification. Evolution has led us to develop many fine-tuned senses, including how much idleness we can get away with and how to recognize it in others. Social loafing does not occur solely in physical performance. We slack off mentally, too. For example, in meetings, the larger the team, the weaker our individual participation. However, once a certain number of participants are involved, our performance plateaus. Whether the group consists of 20 or 100 people is not important. Maximum inertia has been achieved. One question remains. Who came up with the much vaunted idea that teams achieve more than individual workers? Maybe the Japanese. 30 years ago, they flooded global markets with their products. Business economists looked more closely at the industrial miracle and saw that Japanese factories were organized into teams. This model was copied with mixed success. What worked very well in Japan could not be replicated with the Americans and Europeans, perhaps because social loafing rarely happens there. In the West, teams function better if and only if they're small and consist of diverse, specialized people. This makes sense because within such groups, individual performances can be traced back to each specialist. Social loafing has interesting implications. In groups, we tend to hold back, not only in terms of participation, but also in terms of accountability. Nobody wants to take the rap for the misdeeds or poor decisions of the whole group. A glaring example is the prosecution of the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, or less controversially, any board or management team. We hide behind team decisions. The technical term for this is diffusion of responsibility. For the same reason, teams tend to take bigger risks than their members would take on their own. The individual group members reason that they're not the only ones who will be blamed if things go wrong. This effect is called risky shift and is especially hazardous among companies and pension fund strategists where billions are at stake, or in the Defense Department where groups decide on the use of nuclear weapons. In conclusion, people behave differently in groups than when alone. Otherwise, there would be no groups. The disadvantages of groups can be mitigated by making individual performances as visible as possible. Long live meritocracy. Long live the Performance Society. 34. Stumped by a sheet of paper. Exponential growth. A piece of paper is folded in two, then in half again, and again and again. How thick will it be after 50 folds? Write down your guess before you continue reading. Second task. Choose between these options. A. Over the next 30 days, I will give you $1,000 a day. B. Over the next 30 days, I will give you a cent on the first day, 2 cents on the second day, 4 cents on the third day, 8 cents on the fourth day, and so on. Don't think too long about it, A or B. Are you ready? Well, if we assume that a sheet of copy paper is approximately 0.004 inches thick, then its thickness after 50 folds is a little over 60 million miles. This equals the distance between the Earth and the Sun, as you can check easily with a calculator. With the second question, it's worthwhile choosing option B, even though A sounds more tempting. Our ancestors' experiences were mostly of the linear variety. Whoever spent twice the time collecting berries earned double the amount. Whoever hunted 2 mammoths instead of 1 could eat for twice as long. In the Stone Age, people rarely came across exponential growth. Today, things are different. Each year, the number of traffic accidents rises by 7%, warns a politician. Let's be honest, we don't intuitively understand what this means. So let's use a trick and calculate the doubling time. Start with the magic number of 70 and divide it by the growth rate in percent. In this instance, 70 divided by 7 equals 10 years. So what the politician is saying, the number of traffic accidents doubles every 10 years. Pretty alarming. You may ask why the number 70. This has to do with a mathematical concept called logarithm. You can look it up in the notes section. Another example, inflation is at 5%. Whoever hears this thinks, that's not so bad. What's 5% anyway? Let's quickly calculate the doubling time. 70 divided by 5 equals 14 years. In 14 years, a dollar will be worth only half what it is today. A catastrophe for anyone who has a savings account. Suppose you're a journalist and learn that the number of registered dogs in your city is rising by 10% a year. Which headline do you put on your article? Certainly not, dog registrations increasing by 10%. No one will care. News exponentially grows forever. Most politicians, economists, and journalists forget that. Such growth will eventually reach a limit, guaranteed. For example, the intestinal bacterium Escherichia coli divides every 20 minutes. In just a few days, it could cover the whole planet. But since it consumes more oxygen and sugar than is available, its growth has a cutoff point. The ancient Persians were well aware that people struggled with percentage growth. Here's a local tale. There was once a wise courtier who presented the king with a chessboard. Moved by the gift, the king said to him, "Tell me how I can thank you." "Your Highness, I want nothing more than for you to cover the chessboard with rice, putting 1 grain of rice on the first square, and then on every subsequent square, twice the previous number of grains." The king was astonished. "It's an honor to you, dear courtier, that you present such a modest request. But how much rice is that?" The king guessed about a sack. Only when his servants began the task, placing a grain on the first square, 2 grains of rice on the second square, 4 grains of rice on the third, and so on, did he realize that he would need more rice than was growing on Earth. When it comes to growth rates, don't trust your intuition. You don't have any. Accept it. What really helps is a calculator, or with low growth rates, the magic number of 70. 35. Curb your enthusiasm. Winner's curse. Texas in the 1950s. A piece of land is being auctioned. 10 oil companies are vying for it. Each has made an estimate of how much the site is worth. The lowest assessment is $10 million, and the highest is $100 million. The higher the price climbs during the auction, the more firms exit the bidding. Finally, one company submits the highest bid and wins. Champagne corks pop. The winner's curse suggests that the winner of an auction often turns out to be the loser. Industry analysts have noted that companies that regularly emerged as winning bidders from these oil field auctions systematically paid too much and years later went under. This is understandable. If the estimates vary between $10 and $100 million, the actual value most likely lies somewhere in the middle. The highest bid at an auction is often much too high. Unless these bidders have critical information others are not privy to. This was not the case in Texas. The oil managers actually celebrated a Pyrrhic victory. Today, this phenomenon affects us all. From eBay to Groupon to Google AdWords, prices are consistently set by auction. Bidding wars for cell phone frequencies drive telecom companies to the brink of bankruptcy. Airports rent out their commercial spaces to the highest bidder. And if Walmart plans to introduce a new detergent and asks for tenders from 5 suppliers, that's nothing more than an auction, with the risk of the winner's curse. The auctioning of everyday life has now reached tradesmen too, thanks to the internet. When my walls needed a new lick of paint, instead of tracking down the handiest painter, I advertised the job online. 30 painters from more than 300 miles away competed for the job. The best offer was so low that out of compassion, I couldn't accept it. To spare the poor painter, the winner's curse. Initial public offerings, IPOs, are also examples of auctions. And when companies buy other companies, the infamous mergers and acquisitions, the winner's curse is present more often than not. Astoundingly, more than half of all acquisitions destroy value, according to a McKinsey study. So why do we fall victim to the winner's curse? First, the real value of many things is uncertain. Additionally, the more interested parties, the greater the likelihood of an overly enthusiastic bid. Second, we want to outdo competitors. A friend owns a micro-antenna factory and told me about the cutthroat bidding war that Apple instigated during the development of the iPhone. Everyone wants to be the official supplier to Apple, even though whoever gets the contract is likely to lose money. So how much would you pay for $100? Imagine that you and an opponent are invited to take part in such an auction. The rules? Whoever makes the highest offer gets the $100 bill. And, most important, when this happens, both bidders have to pay their final offer. How high will you go? From your perspective, it makes sense to pay $20, $30, or $40. Your opponent does the same. Even $99 seems like a reasonable offer for a $100 bill. Now, your competitor offers $100. If this remains the highest bid, he'll come away breaking even, paying $100 for $100. whereas you will simply have to cough up $99. So you continue to bid. At $110, you have a guaranteed loss of $10, but your opponent would have to shell out $109, his last bid. So he'll continue playing. When do you stop? When will your competitor give up? Try it out with friends. In conclusion, accept this piece of wisdom about auctions from Warren Buffett. Don't go. If you happen to work in an industry where they're inevitable, set a maximum price and deduct 20% from this to offset the winner's curse. Write this number on a piece of paper and don't go a cent over it. 36. Never ask a writer if the novel is autobiographical. Fundamental attribution error. Opening the newspaper, you learn that another CEO has been forced to step down because of bad results. In the sports section, you read that your team's winning season was thanks to player X or coach Y. In history books, you learn that the success of the French army in the early 1800s is a testament to Napoleon's superb leadership and strategy. Every story has a face, it seems. Indeed, this is an ironclad rule in every newsroom. Always on the lookout for the people angle, journalists and their readers take this principle one step further and thus fall prey to the fundamental attribution error. This describes the tendency to overestimate individuals' influence and underestimate external situational factors. In 1967, researchers at Duke University set up the following experiment. Participants read an argument either lauding or loathing Fidel Castro. They were informed that the author of the text had been allocated the viewpoint regardless of his true political views. He was just making a coherent argument. Nevertheless, most of the audience believed what he said reflected his true opinion. They falsely attributed the content of the speech to his character and ignored the external factors. In this case, the professors who had crafted the text. The fundamental attribution error is particularly useful for whittling negative events into neat little packages. For example, the blame for wars we lazily push onto individuals. The Yugoslav assassin in Sarajevo has World War I on his conscience, and Hitler single-handedly caused World War II. Many swallow these simplifications, even though wars are unforeseeable events whose innumerable dynamics we may never fully understand, which sounds a little bit like financial markets and climate issues. Don't you agree? We see the same pattern when companies announce good or bad results. All eyes shift to the CEO's office, even if we know the truth. Economic success depends far more on the overall economic climate and the industry's attractiveness than on brilliant leadership. It's interesting how frequently firms in ailing industries replace their CEOs, and how seldom that happens in booming sectors. Are ailing industries less careful in their recruitment processes? Such decisions are no more rational than what happens between football coaches and their clubs. I often go to musical concerts. In my hometown of Lucerne, in the center of Switzerland, I'm spoiled with one-off classical recitals. During the intermission, however, I noticed that the conversations almost always revolve around the conductors and or soloists. With the exception of world premieres, composition is rarely discussed. Why not? The real miracle of music is, after all, the composition, the creation of sounds, moods, and rhythms, where previously only a blank sheet lay. The differences among scores is 1,000 times more impressive than the difference among performances of the same score. But we don't think like this. The score is, in contrast to the conductors and soloists, faceless. In my career as a fiction writer, I experienced the fundamental attribution error in this way. After a reading, which in itself is a debatable undertaking, the first question really always is, what part of your novel is autobiographical? I often feel like thundering, it's not about me, damn it, it's about the book, the text, the language, the credibility of the story. But unfortunately, my upbringing allows such outbursts only rarely. We shouldn't judge those guilty of the fundamental attribution error too harshly. Our preoccupation with other people stems from our evolutionary past. Belonging to a group was necessary for survival. Reproduction, defense, and hunting large animals, all these were impossible tasks for individuals to achieve alone. Banishment meant certain death, and those who opted for the solitary life, of which there were surely a few, fared no better and disappeared from the gene pool. In short, our lives depended on and revolved around others, which explains why we're so obsessed with our fellow humans today. The result of this infatuation is that we spend about 90% of our time thinking about other people and dedicate just 10% to assessing other factors and contexts. In conclusion, as much as we're fascinated with the spectacle of life, the people on stage are not perfect, self-governed individuals. Instead, they tumble from situation to situation. If you want to understand the current play, really understand it, then forget about the performers. Pay close attention to the dance of influences to which the actors are subjected. 37. Why you shouldn't believe in the stork. False causality. For the inhabitants of the Hebrides, a chain of islands north of Scotland, head lice were a part of life. If the lice left their host, he became sick and feverish. Therefore, to dispel the fever, sick people had lice put in their hair intentionally. There was a method to their madness. As soon as the lice had settled in again, the patient improved. In one city, a study revealed that in each blaze, the more firefighters called out to fight it, the greater the fire damage. The mayor imposed an immediate hiring freeze and cut the firefighting budget. Both stories come from German physics professors Hans-Peter Beck-Bornholdt and Hans Hermann Dubin. In their book, unfortunately there is no English version, they illustrate the muddling of cause and effect. If the lice leave the invalid, it's because he has a fever and they simply get hot feet. When the fever breaks, they return. And the bigger the blaze, the more firefighters were called out. Not, of course, vice versa. We may smirk at these stories, but false causality leads us astray practically every day. Consider the headline, Employee Motivation Leads to Higher Corporate Profits. Does it? Maybe people are simply more motivated because the company's doing well. Another headline touts that the more women on a corporate board, the more profitable the firm is. But is that really how it works? Or do highly profitable firms simply tend to recruit more women to their boards? Business book authors and consultants often operate with similar false, or at least fuzzy, causalities. In the 90s, there was no one holier than the then head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. His obscure remarks gave monetary policy the aura of a secret science that kept the country on the secure path of prosperity. Politicians, journalists, and business leaders idolized Greenspan. Today, we know that these commentators fell victim to false causality. America's symbiosis with China, the globe's low-cost producer and eager buyer of U.S. debt, played a much more important role. In other words, Greenspan was simply lucky that the economy did so well during his tenure. A further example, scientists found that long periods in the hospital affected patients adversely. This was music to health insurers' ears, who of course are keen to make stays as brief as possible. But clearly patients who are discharged immediately are healthier than those who must stay on for treatment. This hardly makes long stays detrimental. Or take this headline. Fact, women who use shampoo XYZ every day have stronger hair. Though the context can be substantiated scientifically, this statement says very little, least of all that the shampoo makes your hair stronger. It might simply be the other way around. Women with strong hair tend to use shampoo XYZ, and perhaps that's because it says, especially for thick hair, on the bottle. Recently, I read that students get better grades at school if their homes contain a lot of books. This study was surely a shot in the arm for booksellers, but it's another fine example of false causality. The simple truth is that educated parents tend to value their children's education more than uneducated ones do. Plus, educated parents often have more books at home. In short, a dust-covered copy of War and Peace alone isn't going to influence anyone's grades. What counts is parents' education levels as well as their genes. The best example of false causality was the supposed relationship between the birth rate and the number of stork pairs in Germany. Both were in decline, and if you plot them on a graph, the two lines of development from 1965 to 1987 appear almost identical. Does this mean the stork actually does bring babies? Obviously not, since this was a purely coincidental correlation. In conclusion, correlation is not causality. Take a closer look at linked events. Sometimes what's presented as the cause turns out to be the effect, and vice versa. And sometimes there's no link at all, just like with the stork and babies. 38. Why attractive people climb the career ladder more quickly. Halo effect. Cisco, the Silicon Valley firm, was once a darling of the new economy. Business journalists gushed about its success in every discipline. Its wonderful customer service, perfect strategy, skillful acquisitions, unique corporate culture, and charismatic CEO. In March 2000, it was the most valuable company in the world. When Cisco's stock plummeted 80% the following year, the journalists changed their tune. Suddenly, the company's competitive advantages were reframed as destructive shortcomings: poor customer service, a woolly strategy, clumsy acquisitions, a lame corporate culture, and an insipid CEO. All this, and yet neither the strategy nor the CEO had changed. What had changed in the wake of the dot-com crash was demand for Cisco's product, and that was through no fault of the firm. The halo effect occurs when a single aspect dazzles us and affects how we see the full picture. In the case of Cisco, its halo shone particularly bright. Journalists were astounded by its stock prices and assumed the entire business was just as brilliant, without closer investigation. The halo effect always works the same way. We take a simple to obtain or remarkable fact or detail, such as a company's financial situation, and extrapolate conclusions from there that are harder to nail down, such as the merit of its management or the feasibility of its strategy. We often ascribe success and superiority where little is due, such as when we favor products from a manufacturer simply because of its good reputation. Another example of the halo effect: we believe that CEOs who are successful in one industry will thrive in any